Hi, I'm Susan Dixon with the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, and I want to welcome everybody to our March meeting. We have a very important Chinese American scholar as our speaker tonight. So I'd like to introduce Sue Fawn Chung. She was actually born in Los Angeles, went to UCLA, got a master's degree at Harvard and then her PhD at UC Berkeley. But her professional life was at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And she has written 4 books on Chinese American history. She's quite a scholar, and she's going to tell us about her research and studies of the Chinese that were in Truckee. So please, when you have many questions on her work, put your questions in the chat. Our president, Eugene Moy, is stuck in traffic, so he will be doing the Q&A at the end. And so he will join us sometime during the meeting. If not, I can read chat myself and we'll pick it up from there. So, Sue Fawn?
Good evening. My name is Sue Fawn Chung, and tonight I'm going to talk about Chinese Americans in Truckee, California, a rural Chinatown. My interest in rural Chinatowns was stimulated by the 1882 Foundation conference last summer on rural Chinatowns. Whenever you talk about immigrants, you have to talk about where they came from and have a small understanding of the culture and civilization from which they came. For the 19th century Chinese, they came primarily from Guangdong province, one of 18 provinces in a country that was larger than the United States. The primary capital was Canton, or Guangzhou in Chinese. These Chinese came from 4 counties in Guangdong. You can see them in green. There are Wuyi today, but in the 19th century it was Taishan, Kaiping, Enping, and Xinwei, or in Cantonese, Toisan, Huiping, Yanping, Xinwei. And the new one that was added to make 5 is Heshan. The 3 counties are colored in purple, and they include Nanhai, Shenda, Panyu, and often they roll into this Guangzhou, Zhongshan, and Hong Kong. Now, a lot of people think that the Cantonese are all the same, but they actually have 7 to 9 dialects of Cantonese, and some of them are mutually unintelligible. They also cook in different styles, have different folk beliefs and customs, so they are not all alike. The earlier immigrants to the United States came from Zhongshan, which is a natural port area for debarkation. The Pearl River Delta is similar to Florida because it is hot weather, humid weather, thunderstorms, and so forth, but it grows a variety of foodstuffs, and so the Delta is known for their excellent cooks. There are 4 main social status in Confucianism: the scholar official at the top, who are the leaders, the peasant farmers who provide the food, the artisans, which include doctors and soldiers, and finally at the bottom, unlike the Western world, merchants, who are considered the self-interested people. There were lots of reasons to leave China at this time, but primarily there was a huge population growth by 1800, which meant that there was a lack of arable land and people began to starve. So poverty was high, banditry was high, land tenancy was high, and then combining all of this, foreign invasions came with flooding, famine, and weak leadership by the Manchus, a nomadic tribe under the Qing dynasty that will rule from 1644 to 1911. The importation of Western goods put a lot of Chinese in this area out of work, particularly those who made cloth and flour. And there were a lot of peasant uprisings, but one of the ones that affected southeast China the most was the Hakka-Bundi War of 1855 to 1867. And for those immigrants who came to the United States, they continued that war in the United States. There were lots of economic and social troubles. One of them, for example, was the government denuded the forest to make way for tea plantations, which was the increased trade with the Western countries. There was a lot of growing anti-Manchu sentiment as well. So the Chinese went overseas for new economic opportunities, the ability to send money home, and to gain new freedoms. They built new homes, the country's second rail systems, watchtowers, schools, hospitals, and other public buildings with the money that they sent home. And in 1903, they sent $110 million US, and in 1937, that increased to $517 million. So you can see there was a great interest in that. As they sent this money home, they improved the land and the communities in which they had lived. Many of the villages have this typical outline, such as this Shandong village in Kaiping. You have the older section on the left side and the newer, more modern section on the right side, and you can tell the difference between the two. But one of the interesting aspects of doing an archaeological study of this area was we found a lot of Western or American goods there, and we see that this was an area and a time in which Western ideas, values, and so forth became influential. One of the typical examples of the influence of overseas Chinese was this lovely home built by Henry Yup, who was born in Kaiping, and his father worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. He went home, married a girl, built this Western-style house, multi-storied Western architectural style, and he was unable to bring his family over until after he served in World War II. Most of the Chinese immigrated from Guangdong and in smaller numbers from Fujian province to the north of Guangdong. They took the long trip across the Pacific, some in junks, not particularly the small one like this, but larger ones, which took 3 to 6 months to get across to the United States. It was the least expensive but the most dangerous way to make the crossing. Most of the immigrants came on the steamships, such as the SS City of Peking, shown here, which will land in San Francisco as part of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which was in service from 1874 to 1903. One of the interesting aspects of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company was that it was headed by Leland Stanford, one of the big four of the railroad. The boat trip took about 30 to 60 days, cost $40 to $50 in U.S. money, but it only took $20 to $30 to go back to China in the 1850s and the 1860s. They landed in San Francisco, and some landed in Monterey, San Diego, in the state of Washington and other ports. And by 1870, the U.S. Chinese population was 63,000, with 77% in California. The main draw was the 1849 California gold rush. They first went to California, then spread out to Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and so forth. And they brought with them very interesting equipment, such as the shoulder pole, from which you could carry your long tom, or luggage, or even a heavy iron stove to keep things warm. Now, some Chinese miners worked with other ethnic groups, and a few even became co-owners on claims with Euro-Americans because they could not file original claims by local law. In 1852, they constituted 25% of California's miners. The original Chinese group were hired by an American firm to do mining as a group, but eventually they formed their own groups. They did placer mining, eventually would move into hard rock mining, and for protection from other miners, they often joined tongs, such as the Qigong Tong or the Chinese Freemasons, for protection in relatively isolated places. Turning our attention to Truckee, one of the interesting aspects of it is the Truckee River flows in from California into Nevada, and this will be the area of interest for us. As the Nevada County Reporter commented, one Chinese group profited $2,200 from a formerly worthless claim, and they were able to take old abandoned claims and find enough gold to make it profitable for them because of the technology that they use that they brought from China, which was different from what the Western miners used. Throughout the 1860s, the Chinese were replacing Americans in placer and riverbed mining and other occupations, and therein arose xenophobia, or fear of the Chinese, particularly by labor unionists who felt that they were cheap labor. Now, turning to Truckee, we see that Truckee is near Lake Tahoe and near the border of the state of Nevada and the state of California. The big influence, though, of people moving into Truckee was not mining, although there was a lot of mining in the area, but the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, or the Central Pacific Railroad, as it was called, from 1864 to 1869. And in January of 1861, 21 Chinese were hired to work on the Central Pacific. Then another 50 were added, and before long, thousands were added, anywhere from 12,000 to 15,000, and some even estimate 20,000, depending on what you count as being an employee of the railroad system. But Truckee was a railroad town. It grew prosperous because the railroad was there. And as Gordon Chang of Stanford University said, they did what was considered impossible at the time. They endured scorching heat, dirt, smoke, fumes from the use of explosives. They used physical labor to move huge boulders. They survived isolation, winds, and all sorts of other problems, including encountering wild animals that they had never seen before. The railroad supervisor was Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four, and because they had been dissatisfied with Irish workers, they turned to the Chinese, many of them first being hired in the Dutch Flat, Auburn area. And when the train was finally completed, it was very interesting. A lot of places would not allow the Chinese to disembark, but would allow them to ride in immigrant cars at the back of the train, and if they had worked for the train, they could ride for free. Now, Crocker owned property in Truckee and gradually sold parcels to the Chinese in the area, giving them an ownership in land which they valued. He was assisted by James Harvey Strobridge, who lived from 1827 to 1921. And there was a myth that circulated for decades that Strobridge opposed hiring the Chinese, but this wasn't true if you look at letters and his own background. He had worked with the Chinese on the San Francisco-San Jose line and on his farm in California. And later, after briefly working on the Southern Pacific Railroad, he told Crocker he was going to retire. But if Crocker wanted him out of retirement, he had to bring him 8,000 Chinese to do construction work. And so in a private letter, Crocker agreed, and Strobridge resumed working on railroads to be one of the major contributors to the building of railroads. In 1868, the Chinese began to arrive and settle in Truckee, as 4,000 Chinese crew members worked in the area for the Central Pacific. When the Central Pacific reached Reno, present-day Reno, they said, we'll only keep 5,000 workers to go across Nevada, So many of the released workers settled in Truckee, working for the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which began construction in 1868 to 1869, and then the Carson in Colorado under Harrington and Duane L. Bliss. Now, Truckee was an important railroad division for the Central Pacific, and here's a picture of its station, the woodshed for fuel, a coal shed, and a Catholic church near the roundhouse. So being a roundhouse is very central to the railroads. And we see that here in Truckee and all along the line, a lot of Chinese cooks opened restaurants or were sponsored for their restaurant in order to provide meals 24 hours a day for those who worked for the railroad or for those passengers passing through. But after 1882 and 1892, two of the major Chinese Exclusion Acts, we see other minorities being hired to work for the railroad. While working for the railroad, the Chinese lived in tents, as you can see in the center and to the left, but occasionally they also settled into cabins and cabins that could be moved on sleds, and a few of them even lived with Euro-Americans in their settlement. Summit Camp is one of the typical camps where the Chinese lived for 2 years at least. It's the longest single camp for Chinese occupation, and in December of 2024, it was awarded National Historic Landmark status, even though there is nothing really left of Summit Camp except for archaeologists. On May 10, 1869, the Golden Spike ceremony occurred, joining the Central Pacific with the Union Pacific to make the first transcontinental railroad. Now, one of the prevailing myths was that there were no Chinese at the ceremony, but if you look at Andrew Russell's iconic photograph, East Meets West, you can see in the foreground a Chinese man wearing the typical coat with patches and a typical type of hat that was favored by the Chinese. If you look even closer, you can count 2 other men in this scene. So the truth is, there were Chinese at this ceremony. Until recently, the Chinese were forgotten railroad workers, but during the 150th anniversary, they began to be recognized in the county of Nevada as well as throughout the United States. And Truckee even designated Truckee's Chinatown, which has now disappeared, in May of 2024. Well, let's look at Truckee's Chinatowns. In 1868, the first Chinatown was located on the corner of Spring and Jeboom Streets behind Front Street in the triangular area on this slide. Truckee had 25 saloons, typical of rural towns at this time, 10 dry goods and clothing stores, 5 grocery stores, 7 lodging houses, and 16 what they called China shops, laundries, barbershops, tea shops, peanut stands, a red light district, a bathhouse, and other businesses. And this is what Truckee's Chinatown looked like about 1870, where there were about 407 Chinese listed in the town, and they represented 45% of the workforce. The residents included 11 merchants, including Fong Li, whom we'll talk about, woodcutters who were making $20 a day, some counted as part of the railroad system, others working for loggers who sold their wood to the railroad. There were 4 doctors, and there were laundrymen and 22 prostitutes. Well, what did their homes look like? This isn't the homes in Truckee, but in Monterey's Canterbury Road, and the Truckee homes sort of resembled this, but were demolished in 2022 to 2023 on the south side of the river. The Truckee Republican newspaper, owned by Charles McLaughlin, wrote in 1870, Truckee's bathhouse is carried on by a Celestial, that is Chinese, named Wali, but he manages the establishment in true American style. Lovers of cleanliness, and this includes everybody, will be delighted with the arrangement of this bathing establishment if they give Wally a call. Well, what did it look like? We really don't know, but this is the bathhouse in Calico, California, built around the same time. Now, although this slide is fuzzy, we get an idea of what some of the Chinese looked like at this time in 1870s in Truckees. And you can see in this selection, 2 men are wearing Western-style clothing, and one is wearing a Western-style hat. And this was typical of a lot of the Chinese beginning to adapt to Western styles and Western clothing as they grow in population, reaching a height in 1880 and 1890. The old jailhouse was a brick building on the site of Truckee's first Chinatown. And originally there were 16 wooden shops located in this area, but in 1875 a fire destroyed 40 Chinese buildings and 4 houses and about 13 hogs and other losses totaling $60,000. But the Chinese had no insurance, so that they had to build back up from the wealth that they had, and many of the wealthier Chinese rebuilt their buildings in brick. But the local population wanted Chinatown to move from the center of town across to the south side of the river. This problem of Chinatowns being in a central part and then the town growing around it, and then the population wanting to move the Chinatown out of the area, was typical of many rural towns in the American West. Well, today the Truckee Jail Museum sits on this site, and they finally dedicated a lovely historic plaque to Truckee's Chinatown in May of 2024. Now, one of the big companies in this area and in every major train stop at this time was Sisson Wallace and Company. And Clark Crocker, the younger brother of Charles, was a partner in this firm as well. They were the major suppliers of Chinese labor, and they were a Wells Fargo agent. They had centrally located stores and provided all kinds of provisions, liquors, and clothing and hardware for the families. They also sold tea from China, silks and porcelains from China, so it was a very upscale store to visit. What we see happening is that they became the largest employer of Chinese woodcutters in Truckee, and the company had labor recruiters in South China who had the workers sign a contract for a specific work time, 3 to 4 years, a set salary, a repayment system for repaying the company for the cost of their transportation to the United States. And what we see happening is with the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the deaths of Sisson Wallace and even Clark Crocker, it made it difficult for the company to continue their overseas Chinese recruiting. This is what their store looked like at the time. At first their store was made of wood and then brick, and they would purchase large quantities of teas for their worker, which they bought directly from Hong Kong wholesalers. And because they also had to have a lot of pork on hand for the Chinese, they even went into the pork production in Los Angeles. And because the Chinese ate a lot of fish, they even owned a fish cannery in Alaska. So they spread out the kinds of work that they did. And their stores were described as being a large firm, a beautiful firm, located very well in many parts along the railroad track. Now, from the assessor's office in Nevada County, we see that between 1868 and 1870, 28 Chinese men owned property in and around Truckee. This included the herbalist Hong Gin-Wu, who was also a merchant, and the merchant Fong Li, whose Chinese name was Chin Kong Yo. But what happened is a lot of people would recognize the name of his company rather than his own name. Other Chinese were listed. Sisson and Wallace was also a major landowner, and the Central Pacific and Charles Crocker were also landowners in Truckee. Now, you might ask, well, why was Fong Li called Fong Li when his real name was Qin Guangyu? His last name was Chun, and there's an article that I recently wrote on the puzzles of Cantonese names, and so if you're interested, buy a copy of Kanto IE, which will come out at the end of this year. Now, the merchants in all rural Chinatowns were the leaders of the community, and part of the reason was they could read and write, but not read and write the classics, which in China was the mark of a literate man. So that's why they often were considered illiterate, and many of them knew Chinese and English law because it was important for the community for them to do so. And so we see that Fong Li, who's pictured here courtesy of Linda Bentz, was just one of these types of men, and he resisted the movement of Chinatown to the south side of the river, and was able to preserve his store for many years until one of the anti-Chinese movements drove him out of Truckee, and he moved to Oroville and died there in 1897. Well, Fong Li's store sold merchandise and groceries next to Sisson, Wallace and Company's store and the China Hotel. His store was partially destroyed by fire in 1872, and then he decided, I'm going to build my store of brick just like Sisson and Wallace, and it cost him a considerable amount of money, but he was very wealthy by this time, having worn a diamond ring and having bodyguards and so forth. And what we see is he was able to survive the anti-Chinese movement, which was growing in force and spreading out throughout the western part of the United States. And a lot of the reason for it was the anger and anxiety and the xenophobia raised by fiction books, magazine stories, newspaper articles, talks, all kinds of inspiring to action against the Chinese that occurred in this period from 1870 until 1882, when the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act occurred, and when they were dissatisfied with that, on to more violent actions. And we see that the site of Chinatown then moved to the south of the Truckee River because the Caucasian League burned the second Chinatown 3 times in 1878, and one of the few that has remained in Truckee is the Chinese herbalist store, which you see here. And you can see when the Chinese moved to the south of the river how many buildings and that they occupied at this time. The new Chinatown had 700 residents, 11 merchants or grocers, and some of them were very rich, Fong Li being the richest, and he paid $10,000 to have his brick store built. There were also 4 doctors, 2 miners, 18 laundrymen, but there were also important at this time railroad workers living in Truckee and working there, as well as woodcutters, which were not necessarily counted in the city count or the town count because they usually were working out in the forest. Well, there were other occupations besides the woodcutters and the railroad workers. There were laundrymen, which was typical in a lot of Chinatowns throughout the western United States and even the eastern United States. And part of the reason why they were so good at working with cloth is because they had been cloth makers or dye makers in every village in South China, but with the importation of Western-made cloth, they were out of a job, and so they emigrated to the West. Now, the herbal store has been a focus of a lot of interest because it survived the fires, because of its brick building and iron doors and windows. And then in the 1920s to the 60s, it was a bottling works, and we can see from it that it was located in a ideal part of town, and the road that will go to the town of Truckee is right by its side. Today it looks like this. It's an interior company which has been remodeled and refurbished and renovated. In the back was where the herbalist lived, and he had a beautiful view of the town. And on the side of the house, in the lower right hand side, you can see the herbal garden where he grew his herbs. What did it look like inside? Something like this. This is a 1903 San Francisco herb shop. And we see that by 1880 there were only two Chinese herbalists, one who was 64 and one who was 30, who did not live together, so they probably served separate parts of the population. Primarily women were very interested in Chinese herbs at the time. Now, the other most important workers, of course, were those woodcutters, for wood was demanded not only for the trains, but for heating, for building wooden buildings, for even making things like spinning wheels and boxes and cartons and crates and barrels and endless things of wood. And so this is a typical wood camp in the area. And the Chinese would work with cutting the trees and trimming the trees and making core wood and floating the wood into the sawmills. And here is one of the very few pictures of a group of Chinese loggers or woodcutters in 1890, and you can see some of them are in Western dress, some of them are in half Chinese, half Western dress, but they all like to wear this type of rounded hat. They also worked on flumes, and this is a typical flume going down. Today it ends in the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City. But the man had to balance on both sides to keep the wood flowing down, sometimes at 75 miles an hour. And if you misstepped, you fell into the wood and you could be injured. They also did the wood ponds, like on your right-hand side. Now, Ellie Ellen of Truckee was one of the major woodcutters who hired the Chinese, and from his records we know that he paid the woodcutters of any ethnic group the same amount of money as long as they cut a certain amount of wood. And he paid his loaders, that is freighters, $2.50 a day regardless of their ethnicity. And he had a Chinese cook, and he was considered the last holdout against the anti-Chinese club members, which we'll talk about a little later. And so you can see the logging trains, and here is a logging camp with the typical Chinese cook, which could have been any time in the late 19th century. One of the most famous cooks of the period was Tai Sing, who was born in Virginia City, and here he is in cutting core wood in Yosemite. And he's famous because the Chinese Historical Society has an annual pilgrimage to Sing Peak near Yosemite, and here you see him cutting core wood, which is 4 feet high, 8 feet long, and 4 feet deep, used for trains, mines, sawmills, homes, you name it. And this pile on your left-hand side is wood in the Sierra Nevada mountains that has been there for over 100 years. Now, what do they do with core wood? Well, they make it into wood coal, and they've done this for many centuries. And near Truckee, in a community called Old Greenwood, Susan Lindstrom found about 150 to 300 charcoal kilns, that is wood charcoal kilns, which looks like this. And it's something that the Chinese had been doing for centuries. And they used the soot from the wood, from the smoking, for their Chinese ink. So it's the beginning of writing, they had it. So when you do an archaeological study looking for signs of it, you see the timber and you see the little wooden charco on the right hand of the slide. They would pile up the wood, something like this, and they would put it in a kiln. Now this is a beehive kiln in an Italian style, and they had different styles of the kilns. The ones in Truckee in Old Greenwood were Chinese styles, but we don't have a picture of it. When you go to these sites, you can find the charco, which is in the middle left. You can see sometimes the lumber that has been cut but not used. You often find a walk and scattered pottery, as well as opium tins. And people go, well, how could you find opium tins? Well, the work was so hard that you need a tincture of opium to kill the pain, just like aspirin is used today. As long as you don't use too much, you don't get addicted. What happens at this time was the rising anti-Chinese movement, which really started in force in the 1870s, just after the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, because they saw, the Euro-Americans saw the release of thousands of Chinese workers, and they said, oh, they're going to take our jobs. This is cheap Chinese labor, and we have to fight against them. Well, the movement actually begins in the 1850s with miners forbidding the Chinese to stake claims, and increases by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And using popular media and speeches and other things, and the passage of all kinds of anti-Chinese legislation, we see that the spirit, the movement begins to rise in intensity, as well as lead to violence, such as destroying Chinatowns, such as the 1869 Unionville destruction, the 1903 in the upper right-hand corner, the labor union in Reno drove the Chinese out during a period of snow and winter cold, and then of course Truckee, constantly having their Chinatown destroyed. Truckee was also noted for how to get rid of the Chinese, and one of them was the Trout Creek outrage in 1876. In this outrage, 2 Chinese cabins were set on fire by 7 members of the Truckee Caucasian League, who fired on 6 fleeing Chinese from the cabins, killing 1, wounding 1. And when the 7 men were arrested and brought to trial, they were found not guilty of arson and murder, because by law the Chinese could not testify against Euro-Americans, so their testimony was considered not relevant, and so without any witnesses to the crime, they were innocent. Anti-Chinese movements reached a new regional height after the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, because it didn't seem like the act solved the problem of Chinese employees. And so McLaughlin became head of the Anti-Chinese League that covered the western United States, particularly California, and they resolved that the Chinese must go, and so they had to figure out how to do it. Well, one place, Eureka, said what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the Chinese by driving them out and shipping them to San Francisco, and if they didn't leave Eureka, we were going to erect hanging gallows for those who did not leave. And so this became one violent model of the anti-Chinese movement. But Truckee was noted for its more peaceful method of getting rid of the Chinese. McLaughlin said we want to destroy their property, expel the Chinese physically, but also boycott Chinese businesses and firms employing the Chinese. And this was the most forceful part of his program. It was made widespread by the Caucasian League in Truckee, and because he had the Anti-Chinese League regionally, this became adopted by a lot of towns in Northern California. 40 towns in California alone drove out the Chinese using this system, but also becoming violent simply because when you get mob action together, they tend to get really violent and try to burn out the system. And so we see the Truckee Republican, like many newspapers in the area, having regular articles against the Chinese, trying to move them out of the system. And so for Nevada County, we see the population beginning to drop from a high in 1880 of 3,000 to a low in 1900 of about 632 people. The expelling of Chinese intensifies, and we see it in Tacoma, Washington, where they visited homes and businesses of the Chinese and tried to ship them to Portland and other western towns, then torching Chinatown. Torching Chinatown was very common at this time. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, it had one of the most violent of all of these. 150 Euro-American coal miners from the Union Pacific Railroad, many of them members of the Knights of Labor, attacked about 300 to 700 Chinese coal workers, killing over 28, wounding 15, and driving several hundred out of town, destroying 75 homes, and burning all of Chinatown, all the tents, all the places that they lived in or worked in or had merchandise stores. And one of the interesting things that we learned from this is that 40% of the Chinese at Rock Springs at this time were of the Liu clan from Canton, from Toisan. And so when the Chinese asked for an indemnity, for which is what usually happens in this kind of case, the U.S. government finally ponied up $147,748 to cover property losses in all of the destroyed property during the 1885-86 riots. Unfortunately, the people of Rock Springs who were forced to move back to Rock Springs and continue their work received none of this money. That Grace and Ricky Liu will sponsor a Rock Springs tour, and you can find out more about it at this site. Inspired by the Truckee method, we see that the system of getting rid of the Chinese continued, and in 1903 it affected Tonopah, in which one old Chinese laundryman was killed. He'd lived in the United States for 30 years. But it was very interesting because some of the people, on your right-hand side you see Mrs. Billy Ford and her two sons, were protected by Euro-Americans. Well, what happened to the Chinese in Truckee at this time? We see that Fong Li moves to Oroville. He contributes to this wonderful temple, which is well recognized and has some beautiful imperial objects from the Emperor of China, the Guangxu Emperor, his descendants still live in the Oroville, Marysville area. The Chinese in Eureka decided that they were going to also fight back. They hired a famous San Francisco attorney, and one of the Chinese remained in the area, again, like Mrs. Billy Ford, protected by the man he worked for, and he decided he worked for them until they passed away. He married a Native American woman named Minnie Tom, and their children and descendants still live in Eureka today. So what we see happening is that the expulsion saw Billy Ford and his family. One of the good things about her being protected in a Euro-American family is she adopted Western ways and Western clothing. She was born in Sacramento but lived in Chinatown, so she had traditional ways, but her husband was very Americanized. In fact, the newspaper in Tonopah said he's one of the most Americanized Chinese in existence as far as they were concerned. But in Rock Springs, what is also interesting is that the Liu clan continued to live in Rock Springs, and today they still have Ricky Liu, who was the past president of our organization, still living, having property in Rock Springs and being very connected with Rock Springs. Now, one of the things that the Chinese valued was land ownership in China, and they tried to own land in the United States. For a while they could, and what we see happening is that California will pass the equivalent of alien land laws until they officially adopted it in 1913, and then it spread beyond California. But Nevada had a different situation, and they allowed resident aliens to own land. So there is an attraction to living in Truckee, owning land in nearby Nevada, especially forest land, and therefore being part of those people who could own land in the United States. Now, Chinese American leaders had to be aware of immigration laws, and so we see a lot of them being passed throughout this period and really harming the Chinese population. And so the population of the Chinese rapidly declined, and you can see them in comparison with other ethnic groups who came at this time. And so by 1930, we see that maybe there were very few Chinese here, and very few of the Chinese who were here were citizens. There were several factors that really harmed the Chinese in the system of discrimination. One was the inability to testify in court. Another was the inability to be naturalized American citizens. And the third was the loss of birthrights. And we see some of these issues still existing in the United States today. Truckee is an example of a rural Chinatown in the American West. In the beginning, the people were accepted because of the services the Chinese provided to them in the early years. Secondly, the community believed in the benefits from building a railroad, which would help in the population and economic development of their town. And so in the early years, there were some positive interactions between the different ethnic groups. But the widespread anti-Chinese sentiment, beginning in the 1850s and then rising in the 1870s, the economic depression of the 1870s, the rise of labor unions and anti-Chinese groups, the power of the growing mass media, and the aspiring politicians like McClaslin, who found the anti-Chinese platform beneficial, led to a rise in violence and racism. And the negative effects of this racism and discrimination meant the eventual departure from Truckee. And we see this in many towns, but you have to remember that in some towns the Chinese prevailed and they stayed in those towns. For more information, you can read my books, The Chinese in the Woods or In Pursuit of Gold, as well as numerous other articles that are coming and books that are coming out at this time, giving us a more realistic analysis of the Chinese experience in the United States. I want to give special thanks to the Truckee, Donner, and Placer County Historical Societies in Nevada, Nevada Historical Society, members of these organizations, and especially to John Knox. And also to thank the many newspapers that contributed articles about the Chinese, special collection libraries, the Library of Congress, the National Archives and Records Administration, and other government agencies, scholars including Dr. Ronald Shu and Calvin Chung Mao of Stanford, archaeologists including Susan Lindstrom, Penny Rux, Carrie Smith, Linda Bentz, and hundreds of other people, including Grace and Rick Leal and the Billy Ford descendants. Really too many institutions and people to name. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, email me at sufawnchung@gmail.com. Thank you.
Like to welcome everyone and thank all of you for joining in. I see a nice crowd. It's nice to see some longtime friends. I don't have old friends, by the way. I have longtime friends. It's always great to catch up. Sufan, can you talk about the connection with Virginia City? Was it the V and T Railroad?
Yes,
Virginia City.
Virginia City had a large Chinatown, so we can't call it a rural Chinatown. At one point, they claimed they had more Chinese than San Francisco, and it's believable in many ways because when you look at the variety of occupations that the Chinese were in Virginia City, you had doctors, you had gamblers, you had prostitutes, you had painters, you had artists, you had dentists, barbers, all kinds of people. And they had two separate Chinatowns, which people didn't realize. But when I plotted it out using the census manuscript, I could see the Ma clan dominated the lower, smaller Chinatown, and the upper Chinatown was mixed. And it even had two women from Shanghai who ran a laundry in Virginia City. But it was a rich mining area.
There's
And
not
so
much left in Virginia City right now, correct?
there are a lot of buildings left, and they've preserved a lot of the old sentiment. And you can see one of the Chinese laundries. It's now called the Yellow House, and it's right across from the courthouse. And it made a lot of money because, the political officials would drop their laundry off at the Yellow House, and the Russian tailor would sew and mend the clothes, and you got your clothes cleaned, mended, and whatever. And so it was one of the most.
Jeff Chop had a question. Hi, Jeff, by the way. Good to see you. Why do you call Chinese woodcutters and not Chinese loggers or Chinese lumberjack?
Because in
call
the
them
census they called woodcutters.
Probably maybe the equivalent of Paul Bunyan's. So his comment was that, well, generally woodworkers were generally craftsmen and making
Well,
furniture and so on.
they
So
were making furniture, though. They were basically cutting wood and making for wood.
right, and we had a response from Phil Sexton. Phil, if you want to unmute yourself, you could add to that. You made a comment.
Thank you, Eugene, and hello, by the way.
Hi.
A lot of the Chinese who were surplused from the railroad, as Sue Fawn mentioned, when they reduced the workforce, were hired to be specifically woodcutters, mostly to cut cordwood for locomotives.
Correct.
And in fact, in 2000, I used to work for the Forest Service, and we were on a fire at Emigrant Gap, and the fire burned through a timber stand that exposed, I think, 4 cabin sites that we determined to have been Chinese woodcutter camps. And we learned from looking at old roads and things that they were hired to be out there in the woods cutting cordwood. And once a week, a white wagon, coming through with a white person would pick up their wood and leave them their pay and their supplies and take it to the railhead at Fulda, where the wood was loaded on flat cars to be taken throughout the Central Pacific Railroad system, because the wood was vital to power steam locomotives. So that's different than logging, where logs go to a lumber mill and they're cut into timber.
But they did both.
Yes, they did.
Yes.
But I'm aware of a lot of work of what I call wood cutters, which were not the same as loggers who cut saw timber.
Right. And one of the tragic things is when I was in the Spooner Summit area and I saw miles of wood that the Chinese had cut. They cut differently from a Westerner. And because of an anti-Chinese movement, the wood was just left there. And it was over 100 years old when I was climbing that area with Penny Rucks, a Forest Service archaeologist.
Yes, there are bicycle trails now that go by a lot of those piles up in Spooner. I've been there. And yes, you're correct.
So it's something that is maybe not well known is that in addition to constructing the railroads, that many Chinese were involved in the waste stations, the fueling stations along the way,
Yes.
whether it's water and cordwood, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And there were
Frampton is on. He was the head of the archaeology group that did the cabin, the Chinese lumber cabin that we were excavating.
so there's just maybe so much more to unearth and discover. I guess,
Yes.
although I guess some of those locations have been mapped, but I don't know whether actual in-ground work has been done at most locations. What can you say about that? Is there, well, there were other towns or wood cutting sites.
Yes.
And by the way, for those who have been on our trips to Yosemite, some of you have probably joined in the trip to the little railroad just outside of Yosemite. And in that particular area, the Sugar Pine Railroad.
Yes,
in
it's
that
wonderful.
area, there's a shack or a cook's
Yes. Yes.
building.
And the Chinese
that
were half of the crew that built that railroad. And then, of course, they always had a Chinese cook. Chinese cooks were really highly prized. And Wawona had a Chinese cook that was paid $40 a month, which is a high salary for a cook at that time in the 1880s.
that's pretty good.
Yes,
But
it's a good salary.
yeah,
Okay. Well, Isaac can't get the the slideshow to work, and I can't get the slideshow to work.
okay. Well,
Yes.
why don't we could just open it up to maybe, well,
Questions.
perhaps you could just kind of follow up and just talk about what we're not seeing. Maybe you
Well,
could just,
what you're not seeing is that um, Fong Li moves on after the Truckee riots and settles in um, the Marysville, Oroville area. He's a big donor to the temple, the Oroville temple that is there, and his descendants still live in Oroville, and so that was one way to get. I couldn't. I tried to trace the herbalist to see where he went, but I couldn't find him. And what we see happening is that this kind of rural Chinatown in Truckee was typical of a lot of the different Chinatowns in rural, isolated areas where at first the people welcomed them because they needed the railroad to come through. They weren't hostile towards them, but as xenophobia or fear of foreigners began to develop, and the fact that the Central Pacific was praising the Chinese labor reliable and cheap, the union was starting to get up, and they didn't want competition from the Chinese. And so we see the tide turns and racism and discrimination and anti-Chinese laws flourish. And the life for the Chinese gets harder and harder during the ensuing years.
so in addition to being part of a labor crew, were some Chinese hired? Were there some timber barons who built nice homes or other folks who built houses and then perhaps hired Chinese to be part of the household?
Yes, there were a lot of Chinese servants. Usually they didn't hire the ones who were loggers or woodcutters. And one of the reasons why Taishan or Toisan people were hired to cut wood is because they had experience. Toisan is really a center for wood products in that part of China. So that was very interesting. And we see that the forests are now in their second and third growth, and it's sort of sad, but a lot of wood was cut, a lot of work was done. They were really had to be very good at fluming because you had to dance around as the logs went down these chutes of water down to a station or a loading place. And the reason why you could find Western teapots and so forth in logging cabins of the Chinese was because the goods were brought up by some Western merchant and sell them the most expensive things that you can, and then he'd take the logs back down to a station.
So, so the early Chinese were sort of a conduit for some art and culture,
Yes.
perhaps.
And of course, when they wanted to get away from it all, or if they had a day off, they went to Truckee. That was one of the big towns that was nearby with a Chinatown attached to it. Reno's Chinatown didn't really start going until much later.
I saw you had a photo of Tai Sing, and for those of you who are new to the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, we have for the past 12 years been making a pilgrimage to Yosemite National Park to see the work that early Chinese performed in the High Sierra, including building mountain roads, working in some of the resort hotels, and doing
And
other construction work. Go ahead.
one of the other things about Tyson that is very important is he was the one that brought attention to Yosemite and the value of Yosemite. And that's, in a way, he played a role in getting Yosemite being named a national park. And he worked for the Geological Society, and this is how he got into all of this, even though he was just a cook. But he was also a proponent of living, enjoying nature and the forests.
Well, I believe he was the head cook for the
Yes, and he was
Geological
born in
Survey.
Virginia City.
Right. And when Stephen Mather, who was influential in political matters, wanted to push the Congress, U.S. Congress, to establish a national park service, because by that time there was already Yellowstone and Yosemite and a few other places that had been established, but there was no single agency that ran all of those national parks. So he had the idea of inviting a whole bunch of mucky mucks, including the head of the National Geographic Society and a few elected officials and newspaper publishers, uh, on a camping trip. And he chose that he asked the Geological Survey, who's your best cook? And he found, hired Tai Sing to manage the food service for this party. And there were probably 20 or 25 people on this trip into the mountains, into the Sierras, south of Yosemite. Actually, they were more in the area of Sequoia National Park and Kings Canyon. But nevertheless, Tai Sing and his assistant, whose name was Eugene, by the way, coincidentally, would create these white tablecloth meals for the members of this party, these people who were being hired. And this is 1915, the 1915 Mather Mountain Party, it's called, and because it's been written up in the history of the National Park Service. But in the following year, 1916, the Congress created the National Park Service. So some attribute that this one Chinese guy or two Chinese guys were very much responsible for making all these important tourists feel comfortable about having sumptuous meals up in the forests. and then that generated enough political goodwill to result in the National Park Service. And by the way, Tai Sing, there's been question about his actual name and his origins. Our board member Linda Bentz, who was actually on, I think, did some of the best research. A number of people have been trying, but it's not been easy trying to, as any of you who have been doing family history research on early Chinese know. A lot of us had paper names, and we didn't always come by a direct route. But it looks like Tai Sing's name was Lim Wee Don. Unless, Linda, you have found something else beyond that. So he was actually a Lim, which seemed to be a common surname among many people who were house servants in Southern California for sure, and cooks in Southern California, like the guys who were on Caliornia Island, or the fellow who was the cook at the Phineas Banning's house in Wilmington. I'm just chatting, so maybe you could continue, maybe share a little bit more with us about your
Well, I think, are there any other questions?
I don't see any unless somebody else. Oh, okay. Alan, thanks you for the wonderful talk, Professor Chung.
Thank you. And thank Linda Bentz, who was the one who said, oh, you're going to give this talk. Are you going to? Would you like to? But you're going to give this talk on Truckee.
Yeah. And Laura Eng has a comment that regarding the Rock Springs massacre of 1885. There's a good article in the New Yorker. And,
wonderful.
It's in, there's a link that she posted in the chat. So, and I'm saving the chat here too. So if anyone has any questions, but it sounds like there's some good research out there. So always hopeful that more will pop up. So it's the work that you do, Sue Fawn, sharing this, that really whets a lot of appetites, because
I hope so. I mean,
yeah,
one of the things that is my goal is to get rid of some of the misinformation that is out there about the Chinese, and to stimulate an interest in Chinese American history.
there's just there was a question. Jeff asked, did they ever catch any of the arsonists?
They would catch the arsonists, but then they wouldn't be punished for it, because the Chinese were the only eyewitness accounts. And even in the case, let's say, of Tonopah, where they had one night watchman who was Caucasian testify against the mob that was arrested, they disregarded it because they said, well, he was busy and it was night and he couldn't see who they really were. So his testimony was not accepted. And all of the people who had killed the Chinese man and burned the part of Chinatown down and everything, they were all let go. So you could do things to the Chinese that were violent and you wouldn't be punished. That only lasted until the Chinese became citizens. That is, the younger generation grew up and could testify against white people.
I forgot to add the second part of Alan's question, and that is, and excuse my my squinting here. I just had my second cataract surgery, so I'm learning to read. So, if Chinese women seeking to enter the U.S. were screened for working in prostitution, let's see, I can't quite see that. One was working in the Chinese-owned red light districts. Who were the prostitutes? Were
The
they all Chinese? I guess is the question.
yeah,
And then was the law barring Chinese from testifying against Euro-Americans based
the
on citizenship or based on race?
it was
That was,
based on uh, citizenship. And also that the Chinese, now, if you were Chinese and you were a Christian convert, but there were very few, you could testify in court. You had to swear on the Bible and state that you were Christian. Okay. So that was one thing. So eventually we'll get some Chinese converts who have that ability to testify in court or to work as an interpreter in court and so forth. But in this early age of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, you had very few who would qualify. Now, Tai Sing would qualify because he was born in Virginia City and raised by Supreme Court Justice Hawley in Virginia City and Carson City. So he knew English and he knew the law. And that was probably helpful to him, even though his calling was being a chef. And oh, I forgot the other part of the question.
oh,
Oh, prostitutes.
yeah,
Yeah, the secret societies were able to sneak some women in as prostitutes, and this is how they were able to get in to the United States. And they followed a lot of the old traditions of Chinese prostitutes. So if you want to learn about prostitutes in America, you really have to go back to learning about prostitutes in China and what their function was, what their status was. And so there were some prostitutes that only served Chinese, but many of the prostitutes were forced to serve non-Chinese in a society which was dominated by men in the West.
right, right. And of course, in the West, there were many non-Chinese prostitutes as well.
Yes.
Um, let's see. Bill had a comment that, well, actually, there are a number of other comments I need to follow up on. But Bill says, in Truckee, the historic Main Street is called Donner Pass Road. The railroad depot is at the heart of the old town. The next block north is called Jiboon Street.
Yes.
It looks like an alley. Maybe you could talk about that. And that's where the jail museum is. Yeah.
Yeah, that was where the original Chinatown was, Jabon Street. And, you know, like Reno, the citizens wanted the Chinese out of the main part of town, and they didn't care where they went, they just wanted them out. And this also happened in a number of other cities, small rural towns, trying to move the town grew up and the Chinese had settled in what became the center of town, so you had to move them out. And that's why Reno's Chinatown was burned in 1903.
Yeah. But at least, as Bill notes, that there was a plaque there now.
Yes. I mean, this is one of the wonderful things that have happened in the last, I would say, 50 years, is that plaques have sprung up acknowledging something that the Chinese did or a contribution that the Chinese made. And I think it's a wonderful recognition of the hard labor that they went through.
And you know, we pass many places in this country, and we just don't have any clue that Chinese had something to do with constructing or building or occupying or growing there at those locations. So there's just so much unwritten history. Phil also notes the charcoal kilns, the Greenwood kilns, are not marked, and of course there's sometimes a good reason why many historic places are not marked, and that's to prevent them from being looted or defaced or damaged. All the pot hunters will be out there scraping everything apart. So that's something that he's noted here. And then a few miles west of Donner Pass at the old highway. Right at the top is Summit Camp, National Historic Landmark now. There'll be a dedication there on July 25th.
No,
So,
19th.
well, Phil says 25th. Which
Oh,
is
they
it?
changed the date. Okay.
Yeah, so it's cold up there. Uh, and then Ricky is adding in that if one, and there was a comment earlier, so Ricky was the model for a monument that is going to be placed to commemorate the 140th anniversary of the 1885 Rock Springs Massacre. So, and there is a link to the website on the chat. So, well, and by the way, there was a comment, are we going to share or communicate? We'll see how we can best share the chat that came out. There were some comments back and forth. Linda Bence noted that the Chinese herbalist shop still exists in Truckee from the second Chinatown, and there is a plaque there on the old jailhouse. Maybe I kind of commented on that already, but
No, the herbal shop is separate from the jailhouse.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
And it was beautifully restored, really lovely.
And the Donner Historical Society, the Donner Summit Historical Society, has a great website with a lot of publications that go actually way back. So if anyone's interested, you can read quite a bit about what is up there. Let's see. A lot of good comments. Janice Liang, my grandmother, was born in Carson City, 1912. Her father had a laundry business. So I think that whole neighborhood was where there were a lot of early Chinese. And then I think there's a railroad museum in Carson City.
Yes, there is. And they had a special exhibit on Chinese railroad workers in Nevada, which also a film was made, and I think it's still available on YouTube. But they had a young lady, documentary filmmaker, do a history of it.
Yeah. So Chuck Kwan says he's been to Truckee many times and never thought to explore Chinese historical landmarks. So I think we've listed a few of them already, from the jailhouse to the lawn. Well, there are multiple buildings. Is there a good starting place for Chuck to start?
He should start at the Historical Society, and someone will tell him where to go and how to find things. And when he walks, there's some mansion that one of the big people lived in, and near his house is one of the areas where I had to walk and, see where the kilns were, the charcoal wood kilns were in existence. And you can see the charcoal on the floor. So you know that this is probably where one of them was. And the Chinese were the main they call them colliers, I think, tending these wood charcoal kilns in the Truckee area. And the kilns were owned by Sisson and Wallace or the Central Pacific or some big company like that. And they don't count those people as workers for the Central Pacific. They're separate. Like if you worked on an irrigation project for the Central Pacific, you weren't an employee of the Central Pacific, but you were an employee of the company that was doing the work building the irrigation for the Central Pacific to have water for the steam engines, this kind of thing.
Is there a handout map at the Historical Society that Chuck could pick up?
Linda could tell you. I don't know.
Okay.
I just, I was taken by various people through Truckee and the Lake Tahoe area from when I first started teaching until I retired. And then I don't go there anymore. No.
By the way, folks, since Sue Fawn retired from
40 years of teaching.
UNLV after a few years, but I can tell you that you can hardly go anywhere in the state of Nevada, whether it's in Elko or any town wherever there's a museum or interpretive exhibit, you'll find Sue Fawn's name on it. So I think you've walked a lot of miles throughout the state. Here's a question from Judy Lee. Could someone enter into the chat your upcoming chapter and the name of the book that's going to be coming out?
Oh, it's called Canto IE, Canto IE, AIIIIEEE, and it's on Chinese American literature, Cantonese American literature. It'll be out by UC Press, and the main editor is a retired professor at UCLA. But my article has got a lot of humor in it because I make fun of how people get named and how the lawyers decided that if you wanted to open a store, your name had to be in the name of the store. And fortunately, they didn't really strictly follow that law, but it was on the books. And so you see a lot of people trying to figure out what was the name of the person if the store's name was Fong Li. Well, it was just easier to call him Fong Li than his Chinese name. And so he became always known as Fong Li.
That was something common
Yes.
that happened in the LA area. Many times,
Yeah.
the mom and pop grocery stores had a certain name, like Johnny's Market, and even if your family bought into it, and you had
your name was Johnny. Yeah.
People would just call you Johnny. Yeah, and that was it. So that was very easy. Susan Dixon had a question. What was the land ownership situation? What were the laws in the Truckee area?
Okay, because Truckee was so close to Nevada, and that was one of the points I was going to make, that the Chinese, when they realized they could buy and own property in Nevada if they were a resident alien, that is to say, they lived in Nevada, you see a lot of the Truckee Chinese claiming residency in Nevada so they could own land, especially wood ranches, which made a lot of money. And then, really their home was in Truckee, but they made this move in order to benefit from that law because the laws in California were strict and they discouraged the Chinese from buying and owning land. And in 1913, they passed the Alien Land Law, which then spread to other states, prohibiting non-citizens from owning land. And it was targeted really against the Japanese, but the Chinese also fell into that same category. So you had to be a citizen to own land.
So during the period of active woodcutting, that would have been prior to the Alien 1912.
Yes. It was the court decision came down in the 1883. But by the late 1870s, the Chinese realized that the first article of the Constitution of Nevada allowed resident aliens to own, buy, sell land. And that was an attraction to moving to Nevada.
Wow, that's a new fact I've never known. So that's really, and so, and that stood in place. It was never amended to prevent aliens from.
No, never amended. Resident alien. So the question was, could you prove that you were a resident alien? Well, a lot of them could because they'd lived there for 30 years or something, and they surely were a resident alien. And they couldn't get citizenship because of the 1790 Act.
Wow, something I never knew. Maybe that's why some of my relatives moved to Reno.
Yes.
Yeah. So apart from Truckee, here's a question. Does your research include cities like I see MT, Deadwood, South Dakota, and Montana, I guess. Butte, Montana. I'm sorry, I can't read, like I said earlier. Like Butte or Deadwood and
Well,
other cities.
I didn't go into Deadwood because there were a group of scholars of my generation that were working on Deadwood and have published on Deadwood. It's a whole very interesting community. Now, in Montana, when I was going through Montana, I met scholars who had studied Montana, and there was a Chinese American woman who made a wonderful documentary about the Chinese in Montana. So he was, she was the sister of the forest ranger that was in charge of Yellowstone. So it was a very interesting connection. He'd come to visit me in Island Mountain, Nevada, when I was doing archaeological dig with Fred Frampton there, uh, looking at a Chinese mining camp.
And let's see, Jeff Chop. Hi, Jeff. By the way, I think I said it already, but haven't seen you in a long time. So he just kind of reinforced the observation. He said, noting that the white loggers actually cut down the trees, and then the Chinese.
No, the Chinese also cut down the trees, and you could tell the
Okay.
difference between the Chinese cut tree and the white cut tree. And I thought that was very interesting. But the Forest Service ranger told me about it. So it depended on the stump that was left, which one was cut by a Chinese and which one was cut by a white team. And it's always a teamwork because these are huge trees that would make, boards for the railroad or housing or things like that. So you wouldn't cut down a little skinny nothing tree. And the
So
straighter
how
the
did the
tree, the
stump
better.
look? So what did the stump look like again? For
The ranger told me it had to be a certain height, and you knew it was then cut by a Chinese
height.
team.
Okay.
Height,
Yeah. All right.
yeah.
Yeah.
The stump,
Yeah,
the height of the stump.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, someone wanted to ask about the August 29th tour. What is the August 29th tour?
That's the Ricky and Grace's.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah. So that's 29th, 30, 31st, and the first 2 days in September. And that would be Ricky, are you able to come online or come into audio and tell us a little bit about
Yes.
the event?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We hear you.
Okay. I posted a link to the website in the chat. It's got
Okay.
the information.
Tell me about it. Tell about the tour a little bit.
So basically, we're going to start in Salt Lake City, where we expect most people will arrive, because Salt Lake is about 2.5 hours from Rock Springs, and
No, 2.5 hours to Evanston.
no, it's an hour from Evanston.
Oh,
So, anyways, we're going to visit Evanston. We're going to go to the rendezvous in Fort Bridger. We're going to go to Green River. There's museums and other things.
Josh.
Joss House in Evanston. These are-
Evanston had a good sized Chinatown.
yes, but we'll have a ceremony at the cemetery in Rock Springs. We have a lot of activities planned.
Look forward to all the historical sites.
I actually was going to hand out a copy of their draft schedule, but since we didn't have a dinner, and I couldn't hand out the little handout that I had made for it. So do go to the website, and you'll find that it's an interesting little jaunt that will be very moving.
Oh,
Yeah.
how about the trip to China, Ricky?
Oh, yeah, my wife and I just got back from a trip to China, Busan, And Ase was one of the interpreters and liaisons between the Union Pacific and the coal miners, and we were able to locate his house in Toisan, and we found his grave marker, and
This is his house as well.
his real name is Leo, so he's probably somehow related to me somehow. 'Cause-
No, it's chain migration, so he is related to you.
Okay. So yeah, it was an exciting trip, and um, I think you'll enjoy this commemoration we're putting
We
together.
think there's a lot of that.
Actually, we brought back a couple of artifacts from his house, so we'll have on
Wow.
display.
Wow. Exciting.
Grace wanted to take back a basket, but we couldn't get it on the plane, so we're having it shipped over.
Yeah. Well, that's great. We're all looking forward. And there are a couple of questions about the Yosemite pilgrimage. The Chinese Historical Society has been organizing a trip every summer. This year, there's two parts to the pilgrimage. There is a part where we follow rangers like Yan Yan Chen on some of the trails in the high country on Tioga Road and other places, or down in the valley. We also go on interpretive walks in the Wawona and the Mariposa Grove area.
And the
But also
Chinese
there's-
laundry. And the Chinese laundry.
Right, I'll get to that. Yeah, and there is the newly opened, and hopefully it stays open with all the federal cutbacks. Hopefully we can have the staffing to keep it open. That's been part of the challenge for the Yosemite management right now. But due to the work efforts of Yan Yan Chan, interpretive specialists, and really just some comments that we, the Historical Society, had made to Yosemite management in the prior few years, funding was found, and the Yosemite Conservancy supported the rehabilitation of the laundry, which had been used as a storage shed for years, and also due to the generous donation of a couple who have a Yosemite legacy, Franklin Yi and Sandra Wong. The laundry opened 2 years ago, and it really is a site that you can see. Unfortunately, it closes for the winter, so you have to get there at the right season. And the fall season, I don't think it's open after October. So, yeah. So this coming year, the Yosemite pilgrimage will be, for the valley, will be in probably mid-September. There's a separate part of our trip, which is the backpack for those who are fit to hike to the top of Sing Peak. And to summit there, you basically do a lot of rock scrambling up to the peak, which is at 10,554 feet above sea level. So keep an eye on our website, and we'll announce the dates. The planning meetings are going on right now. We're just trying to work around some of the new rules for the national parks.
It's a lot of fun, though. I've been on it, so I highly endorse it.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why some of us have been going there for 12 years straight. There's always something to see. It's 8:35, and maybe we ought to give you a break, Sue Fawn, unless
Okay.
there's anyone who has a really burning question. But I've been going through there's a lot of good questions, and I think I hope that all of you can stay with us. We've been providing programs month after month uh, since 1975 when we got our start. So in the fall, we're hoping to have a 50th anniversary celebration. We'll be announcing more details later. We're just trying to get a fix on some of the details. But it's been a really good long ride for many of us because some of us have been around for almost that long. So I see more questions, but it is 8:35, 8:36, so we should really give everyone back their evening. So, and come back next month, though, the first Wednesday, for another program or presentation. Susan, hopefully I'm not going to make a mistake, but I believe we have Russell Lowe coming to share some of his newest work. No, I'm sorry. Russell might be doing this in Cerritos in the following month. And
let me jump in, Jean. It's going to be Curtis Chin is next month, and Russell Lowe will be in Cerritos in May.
Right, thank you. And Curtis Chin can come out with a book called Everything I Ever Learned, I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. So he's a fellow who is a writer and a creative person who grew up in Detroit, Chinatown, and his family's restaurant business. And he'll have some interesting commentary. I have a copy of his book, and my own grandfather, one of my grandfathers, actually worked as a cook in Detroit. I know not where, but I know that he was there. So we'll have we'll have a really interesting insight into what it was like. Here's a copy of the book for you, which my faithful wife just pulled out for me because I could never find anything. She finds it faster than me. But here's Curtis's book, and he's a great writer. We look forward to hearing from him. And then the following month, we'll be hearing, hopefully, from Russell Lowe. So just keep an eye on our website, chssc.org, chssc.org. I see some new names out there, and I hope that you can join the Historical Society. Our membership dues are just very nominal, and you get some great benefits like our annual issue of Gumsan Journal. Gumsan Journal has been published since the very beginning, and there's a new issue in our offices getting ready to be mailed out. Some of you have already received it, and others are still being processed. But it's something to look forward to, and we ourselves are still actively trying to bring you more content. We have new exhibits, we have online exhibits, we have oral histories, we have a little bit of history on our Chinatown associations. There's a lot that is on our website. And thanks to past President Ricky for really helping design it for us, because we do have a whole lot. So I want to bid you all a good evening. Thank you, Susan, for bringing us this great program, and thank you, Sue Fawn, for your always great insight. Thank you all who joined in. Thank you, Phil, for jumping in and offering your insights. Thank you, Ricky. You're past president, but you're still helping us in the background. Thank you, Isaac, for host duties today. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Have a great evening.
Popular.